March 9, 1945, 11:37 p.m., Tokyo. The first Pathfinder dropped its napalm canister from 7,000 feet, and the city caught fire in under 4 seconds. Not smoldered. Not smoked. Caught fire. The wooden houses of the Shitamachi district packed so tightly that neighbors could reach through their windows and touch each other's walls, ignited like paper thrown into a furnace. 1 block, then 3, then 10. The wind was blowing at 28 miles per hour that night, and within 7 minutes, the firestorm had developed its own weather system, pulling cold air inward from the bay and feeding the inferno with oxygen until the temperature at street level reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The canals began to boil. People who jumped into rivers to escape the flames cooked alive in the water. The sky above Tokyo turned the color of a wound, and 100,000 people who had gone to sleep that night would never wake up. But here is the part they never told you in school. Of the 334 American B-29 bombers that flew into the most heavily defended airspace in Asia that night, against hundreds of scrambled Japanese fighters, against massed anti-aircraft batteries, against everything the Empire of Japan could throw into that burning sky, only 12 were shot down. 12 out of 334. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and unforgettable moments from the past that changed everything. That number makes no sense. Not if you understand what Japanese pilots were capable of. Not if you know that some of those men defending Tokyo that night had been flying combat since before Pearl Harbor, with thousands of hours in the cockpit with fire in their eyes and nothing to lose. 12 losses should have been impossible. Unless something on those bombers was not what the Japanese pilots thought it was. Unless the B-29 was hiding something that nobody outside a handful of engineers in Erie, Pennsylvania had fully understood yet. This is the story of that secret, and of the machine that carried it into the most destructive air campaign in the history of human warfare. My name for our purposes tonight is Robert Hatch. He was not a general. He was not a decorated ace. He was a 34-year-old mechanical engineer from Schenectady, New York, who had spent the first decade of his career designing gear trains for industrial turbines. He wore glasses. He was slightly overweight. He once told a colleague that the most exciting thing he had ever done before the war was watch a thunderstorm from the roof of his apartment building. He was by every external measure the most ordinary man in the most ordinary profession imaginable. In the summer of 1941, Robert Hatch was sitting at a drafting table at General Electric's Ordnance Division when his supervisor dropped a folder on his desk. The folder contained a request from the Army Air Forces. They needed someone to think about a problem. The problem, as stated in the folder, sounded almost academic. How do you aim a gun when you are moving fast, your target is moving faster, and you cannot physically touch the gun you are trying to fire? Hatch picked up the folder. He read it twice, and then he did something that would eventually help burn a country to the ground. He started doing the math. To understand why that math mattered, you need to understand what bomber defense looked like in 1941 and why it was failing so catastrophically. The B-29 Flying Fortress. America's premier heavy bomber was defended by men. Real men sitting in real gun positions, physically gripping real machine guns with their real hands at 30,000 feet, in temperatures of 50 degrees below zero. The ball turret gunner was crammed into a plexiglass sphere the size of a large suitcase, dangling from the belly of the aircraft, manually swinging 2 50-caliber machine guns, while his fingers went numb inside his gloves. The waist gunners stood at open holes in the fuselage, with 200-mile-per-hour winds, tearing at their faces, trying to aim at a fighter that was crossing their sight picture at 400 miles per hour, and would be gone in under 2 seconds. Here is the physics problem that was killing American bomber crews. A fighter attacking from the side at 300 miles per hour, when you are flying at 200 miles per hour, has a crossing speed relative to your aircraft of somewhere between 400 and 500 miles per hour. To hit that fighter, you cannot aim at where it is. You have to aim at where it is going to be, accounting for the time your bullet takes to travel the distance between you, which at 500 yards takes roughly half a second. In that half second, the fighter moves nearly 60 feet. So you need to lead your target by 60 feet. But the lead angle changes constantly as the fighter maneuvers. It changes with altitude. It changes with temperature. It changes with the speed differential between you and the target. It changes with the angle of attack. A human being sitting in a frozen gun turret pulling 4 Gs in an evasive maneuver, watching a fighter that has been specifically trained to approach from unpredictable angles, cannot do that calculation. Not reliably. Not fast enough. The Germans had proven this was a solvable problem, at least theoretically. British bombers over the Reich were being slaughtered not because German fighter pilots were braver, but because they had developed attack tactics specifically designed to exploit the gaps in manual gunnery. Come in from below and behind at a slight angle. Stay just outside accurate range. Let the bomber's gunners swing to track you. Wait for their aim to lag, then pull through in a burst and break away before they can correct. It worked spectacularly. RAF Bomber Command was losing crews at rates that bordered on unsustainable. The Army Air Forces looked at the casualty numbers and understood that the problem was not courage. The problem was physics. And physics, unlike courage, responds to engineering. Robert Hatch's folder contained the seed of an answer. What if you separated the gunner from the gun? What if instead of a man physically sitting inside a turret freezing hypoxic, trying to manually compute deflection angles that require millisecond precision, you put the man somewhere warm and safe inside the pressurized cabin and connected him to the gun through a wire? The man provides the target acquisition. The machine provides the mathematics. The turret provides the firepower. None of those 3 elements needs to be in the same place. When Hatch took this idea to his division chief in early 1942, the response was not enthusiastic. The division chief was a practical engineer who had spent his career building things that worked, and what Hatch was describing sounded like it would not work. The computational requirements alone were staggering. To calculate a correct deflection angle in real time, the system would need to measure the angular rate of the target, continuously factor in the bomber's airspeed, the outside air temperature, the altitude, the wind, the parallax offset between the sighting station and the physical gun position, and then drive electrical servos on the turret fast enough to move 20-pound gun assemblies with precision tolerances measured in fractions of a degree. All of it simultaneously. All of it in under a second. Using 1942 technology, which meant no digital computers, no transistors, nothing that did not exist yet. The division chief told Hatch it was an interesting theoretical exercise. He suggested Hatch put it in a memo and move on. Hatch did not move on. He spent the next 4 months in his own time on weekends and evenings building a physical scale model of what he was proposing. Not a working system, just a mechanical demonstration of the core principle using clock gears and hand-machined cams to show that an analog computer could in theory continuously calculate a correct lead angle if fed the right inputs at the right speed. The model sat on a wooden board 2 feet wide. It weighed 11 pounds. It hummed when you turned the crank. And when Hatch demonstrated it to a visiting Army Air Forces procurement officer in the spring of 1942, the officer went quiet for a long moment, looked at the humming gears, and said 4 words that changed the direction of the program. He said, "Put it on paper." What followed was 2 years of engineering work that bordered on the impossible. General Electric assigned a team of 30 engineers to the project under Hatch's technical leadership. The challenge was not conceptual. Hatch had proven the concept worked. The challenge was miniaturization, durability, and precision at scales that existing manufacturing techniques had never attempted. Each sighting station needed its own dedicated analog computer, small enough to fit inside a bomber fuselage, rugged enough to survive combat damage, accurate enough to solve ballistic equations to within fractions of a degree, and reliable enough to function at -50 degrees Fahrenheit after a 7-hour flight from the Mariana Islands. The gears were machined to tolerances of 2/10,000ths of an inch. The electrical servos that drove the turrets were custom designed to move large, heavy gun assemblies with the same precision as a watchmaker's mechanism. The optical sighting heads were engineered to give gunners a targeting picture that the analog computer could interpret regardless of which direction the turret was pointed relative to the line of sight. And then there was the coordination feature, the element that made the system not just revolutionary, but genuinely unlike anything that had ever flown. A single gunner at any sighting station could take control of multiple turrets simultaneously. The fire control officer sitting in the upper blister position could look at the whole tactical picture and dynamically reassign turret control to whichever gunner had the best angle on an incoming threat. When one gunner acquired a target, neighboring turrets could slave to the same tracking solution, creating a convergence of fire from positions spread across 60 feet of aircraft fuselage. No blind spots, no dead angles. No gap that an attacking pilot could exploit by memorizing the geometry of the aircraft's defensive layout the way experienced German and Japanese pilots had learned to exploit the B-17. The B-29 didn't have a geometry to exploit. It had a network. The first production central fire control systems were installed in B-29's, rolling off the Boeing plant in Wichita in late 1943. Test crews flew evaluation missions over the California desert, and the results that came back to Wright Field were the kind of numbers that procurement officers mark with double underlines and show to generals. Effective engagement range 1,000 yards. Double the range of any manually aimed system then in service. Target tracking accuracy through high-G evasive maneuvers, statistically superior to the best human gunner under ideal conditions, and vastly superior under combat conditions. Time from target acquisition to first round fired under 1 second. The program that had started with a 34-year-old engineer from Schenectady staring at an impossible physics problem on a drafting table had produced something that the Army Air Force's own test pilots described in their evaluation reports as, quote, unlike any defensive system previously evaluated. By the spring of 1944, B-29's were being assigned to the newly formed 22nd Bomber Command. By the summer, they were flying their first combat missions from bases in India against targets in occupied China. Japanese fighter pilots encountered the new bomber for the first time over Kyushu in June 1944 and came home with reports that confused their intelligence officers. The Americans had a bomber, the pilots said, that could shoot accurately in multiple directions at once. That could track a fighter through a hard turn and maintain fire. That seemed to have no reliable dead zones. The intelligence officers wrote careful memos noting that the B-29 appeared to have improved defensive armament and recommended that fighter attack profiles be adjusted accordingly. They had no idea, not yet. But the real test was coming. It was coming on the night of March 9, 1945, when General Curtis LeMay would make a decision so reckless that his own staff predicted 70% losses when 334 B-29's would load their bomb bays with 500,000 cylinders of napalm and turn toward Tokyo. And when every Japanese fighter pilot who could reach an airfield would climb into the burning sky to stop them. In Part 2, we will follow those pilots into that fire, watch them discover in the most brutal possible way what they were actually fighting, and see the moment when one of the most experienced interceptor commanders in the Japanese Air Force looked at his squadron's losses and wrote in his after-action report 4 words that tell you everything I do not understand. In Part 1, we watched a 34-year-old engineer named Robert Hatch take an impossible physics problem and turn it into the most revolutionary defensive weapons system ever installed on a combat aircraft. The Central Fire Control System, a computer-directed network that could aim guns faster, farther, and more accurately than any human being alive. The Army Air Forces had approved it. Boeing had installed it. And by the spring of 1944, B-29's carrying Hatch's system were flying combat missions over Japan. But approving a weapon in a test facility in Pennsylvania and actually trusting it in combat over the most heavily defended airspace in Asia are 2 entirely different things. Because in the spring of 1944, the men commanding those B-29 crews had spent their entire careers learning one fundamental truth about aerial gunnery. You trust your eyes, you trust your hands, and you trust the man behind the gun. The idea that a machine should make the decision of when and where to shoot was not just unfamiliar. To certain men in certain offices, it was offensive. And the most dangerous of those men was Brigadier General Walter Donahue. Donahue was not a bad officer. He was by any honest accounting an exceptional one. He had logged over 3,000 hours in military aircraft, had commanded a bomb group in North Africa, and had been wounded twice. He wore his experience like armor, and his opinion on bomber defense carried the full weight of everything he had survived. When the 73rd Bomb Wing began receiving B-29's with the Central Fire Control System in the summer of 1944, Donahue read the technical manual, set it down on his desk, and called his operations officer into his office. "Tell me," he said, "how many enemy aircraft has this machine actually shot down?" The operations officer checked his notes. The system had been in limited combat use for less than 90 days. Confirmed kills attributed directly to the CFC system numbered 4. 4, Donahue repeated. "Yes, sir. My gunners on B-17's in Tunisia shot down 11 in a single engagement, manually, in daylight, without any machine telling them where to point." He closed the folder. "I want fallback procedures written for every crew. If that system malfunctions, and it will malfunction, my men will know how to use their guns the way God intended." The fallback procedures were written. And then Donahue went further. He began requesting that some aircraft be modified to allow manual override of the CFC system at any gunner station, effectively bypassing the analog computers entirely and returning control to direct human operation. His reasoning was tactically coherent. He didn't trust hardware he couldn't see working. He trusted men. Robert Hatch learned about Donahue's override request through a procurement officer who called him from Guam with something close to panic in his voice. The modification Donahue was proposing would not simply add a manual backup. It would alter the electrical architecture of the fire control network in ways that could introduce targeting errors across all 5 sighting stations simultaneously. A crew that switched to manual override mid-engagement and then switched back could, under certain conditions, cause the analog computers to lose their calibration reference entirely. The system would keep firing, but the bullets would not go where the gunners thought they were going. Hatch wrote a 14-page technical objection and submitted it through official channels on a Tuesday. By Friday, he had received a 2-paragraph response informing him that operational doctrine decisions rested with field commanders and that his concerns had been noted. He was 34 years old, slightly overweight, wearing civilian clothes in a building full of uniforms, and he was being told that the system he had spent 2 years building might be quietly dismantled by a general who hadn't read past page 12 of the technical manual. He sat at his desk for a long time that Friday afternoon. Then he picked up the phone and called the one person he knew who might actually be able to change what happened next. Colonel James Wyrick was not famous. He would not become famous. But in the summer of 1944, Wyrick was the 21st Bomber Command's Chief of Armament and had spent enough time with B-29 gunnery data to understand something that Donahue had not yet absorbed. The kill numbers for the CFC system looked modest because the system had been used modestly. Crews were still defaulting to their training instincts, trusting their eyes over their instruments, making micro-corrections that actually degraded the computer's tracking solution. The system was being flown the way a jet aircraft was flown in the 1940s by pilots trained on propeller planes. The hardware was ready. The operators were not. Wyrick had been building a case for a formal comparative evaluation for 3 months. He needed someone who could defend the technical parameters under cross-examination from senior officers. Hatch, he decided, was exactly that person. "I can get you 1 test," Wyrick told him over the phone. 1. Donahue will be there, and so will 2 other wing commanders. If the system performs the way your numbers say it should, we have our answer. If it doesn't, we lose the argument for good. You need to understand what that means." Hatch understood. He had 48 hours to prepare. The evaluation was conducted on the morning of September 14, 1944, at an airfield on Saipan. The test parameters were simple and deliberately harsh. 2 B-29's would fly parallel courses at 25,000 feet. One aircraft carried crews operating under standard manual gunnery procedures. The other carried crews operating the CFC system, exactly as Hatch's technical documentation specified, with no manual corrections, no instinct-based adjustments, complete trust in the analog computers. A third aircraft flew attack simulation passes against both bombers from multiple approach vectors. Gun cameras recorded every tracking solution. Radar measured the accuracy of every engagement relative to a computed ideal intercept. Donahue stood on the observation deck with his arms crossed and watched. The manual gunnery aircraft performed well by historical standards. Its crews were experienced. Their tracking solutions were steady. Against a target approaching from a standard 7 o'clock low position, the gun camera footage showed clean acquisition and consistent fire. Against a target approaching from directly ahead at high speed, the footage showed a 2-second lag before effective tracking was established. Against a target that broke hard left after initial approach and came back from the beam, the gun camera showed the gunner losing the solution entirely for 4 seconds before reacquiring. 4 seconds. At the closing speeds involved, that was the difference between a clean engagement and a fighter that had already fired its cannons and broken away. The CFC aircraft ran the same scenarios. 7 o'clock low acquisition in under 1 second, tracking maintained through the full engagement without interruption. High-speed frontal approach guns leading the target before the gunner's conscious mind had completed processing the threat vector. The analog computers had already solved the geometry. Hard brake left followed by beam attack. The fire control officer in the upper sighting station had anticipated the brake based on the initial approach angle and pre-positioned the beam turrets before the attacking aircraft completed its turn. There was no 4-second gap. There was no gap at all. The radar data was processed that afternoon. Against the standard 7 o'clock approach, both systems showed comparable accuracy. Against the complex multi-vector attack profiles, the CFC system showed a 340% improvement in maintained tracking time and a 67% improvement in computed hit probability over the manual gunnery results. 340%. Donahue looked at the numbers for a long time. The observation deck had gone quiet. Then he turned to Wyrick and said nothing for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice was flat and precise, the voice of a man updating a tactical assessment in real time. "Write the training program," he said. "I want every crew in the wing qualified on full CFC operation within 60 days. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the previous months of obstruction. He simply updated his assessment based on evidence and moved forward, which was Hatch would later reflect exactly what a good officer was supposed to do. The 60-day training push was brutal. Wyrick and Hatch traveled to every major B-29 base in the Mariana Islands with a training team of 6 engineers and 4 senior gunners who had been operating the system since its earliest deployment. The resistance they encountered was not hostile. It was something harder to overcome than hostility. It was habit. Experienced gunners who had spent hundreds of hours developing their manual tracking instincts found it physically difficult to stop making corrections. The training protocol had to be redesigned to include a phase that Hatch privately called the trust exercise, 40 minutes of simulated engagement during which the trainee was required to keep his hands completely still and allow the computer to drive the turret, while the sight picture moved in ways that felt wrong to every instinct the gunner had developed. Most trainees passed after 3 sessions. Some needed 7. A few never fully made the transition, and for those crews, Wyrick quietly assigned them to aircraft that flew in the middle of formation where the combined defensive fire of neighboring B-29's provided additional coverage. By November 1944, the results were showing in combat data. B-29s operating with full CFC doctrine were reporting Japanese fighter attacks breaking off at ranges between 800 and 1,000 yards distances at which previous attackers had approached with relative confidence. Japanese after-action reports captured later in translation noted a pattern of unexplained accuracy from American bombers that seemed inconsistent with known defensive armament. 3 separate Japanese fighter unit commanders submitted requests for updated intelligence on B-29 gunnery capabilities between October and December 1944. Those requests were processed through the intelligence bureaucracy of an empire whose infrastructure was already beginning to crack under American submarine warfare and the grinding pressure of a two-ocean war. The updated intelligence assessments were written. They were distributed. And somewhere between the intelligence office and the fighter pilots who needed the information most, the critical details about how the central fire control system actually worked, the lead calculation, the turret-to-turret coordination, the effective range of 1,000 yards, those details did not arrive. Not clearly, not in time. But the Japanese were learning something. They were learning it the hard way at altitude in the dark over their own burning cities. And what they were learning was forcing them toward a response that nobody in the 21st Bomber Command had anticipated. In Part 3, we will discover what that response was. We will watch Japanese fighter commanders make a desperate tactical decision that would send their best pilots directly into the teeth of the system they didn't understand. And we will see what happens when a nation running out of aircraft fuel and trained pilots decides that the only answer left is to stop trying to outfight a machine and instead put a human body directly into its path. The war was about to get personal in a way that changes everything you think you know about what courage actually costs. By the end of Part 2, Robert Hatch's Central Fire Control System had gone from a folder on a drafting table to official doctrine across every B-29 wing in the Pacific. General Donahue had seen the numbers and changed his mind. Crews were trained, the system was operational, and B-29s were flying over Japan with a defensive network that Japanese fighter pilots had never encountered anything like. But here is what we did not tell you. While American crews were learning to trust the machine, Japanese intelligence officers were collecting the reports of every pilot who survived an engagement with a B-29. They were reading those reports very carefully, and by December 1944, they had reached a conclusion that was equal parts accurate and catastrophic for the men tasked with acting on it. The conclusion was, the B-29's guns were too accurate to engage from standard distances. The only solution was to get closer, much closer. And what happened next would cost Japan some of the finest pilots it had left. In December 1944, the 10th Air Division of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force convened an emergency tactical review at Tachikawa Air Base outside Tokyo. The intelligence summary on the table documented something that the division commander, Major General Yasuna Kozono, found genuinely difficult to accept. In engagements over the previous 3 months, Japanese fighter units attacking B-29s at ranges between 500 and 800 yards, the standard combat range against B-17's and B-24's, were being tracked, engaged, and hit with a consistency that statistical analysis could not attribute to normal human gunnery. 17 pilots lost in October, 23 in November. The loss rates were not just high, they were accelerating, and the survivor reports told the same story over and over. The guns came from multiple directions simultaneously. The tracers appeared before the pilot had completed his attack setup. The fire followed through evasive turns that should have broken any manual tracking solution. Kozono understood some of what he was reading. Japanese technical intelligence had examined components recovered from B-29s that made emergency landings in Soviet territory earlier in 1944 and had identified the remote turret architecture and the existence of electronic fire control linkages. What the intelligence assessment had not adequately communicated was the computational element, the lead calculation, the turret coordination, the effective range of 1,000 yards. So Kozono drew the wrong conclusion from partially correct information. If the guns were too accurate at 500 yards, the answer was to close to 100 yards before firing. Get inside the system's optimal engagement envelope. Use the aircraft's maneuverability to arrive at point-blank range before the computers could develop a clean tracking solution. He issued new attack doctrine on December 19, 1944. Close attack profiles, maximum aggression, minimum range before weapon release. He was sending his pilots directly into the kill zone of a system designed to be most lethal at exactly those ranges. The results when they arrived were devastating. Through January and February 1945, Japanese fighter units executing the new close attack doctrine were losing aircraft at rates that unit commanders reported with language that had moved past tactical assessment into something closer to despair. One squadron commander submitted an after-action report on February 7, 1945, following a night engagement over Nagoya that contained a single sentence which was later recovered in captured records. The sentence read, "I do not understand what is happening to my pilots at close range." He did not understand because nobody had told him clearly enough what he was actually fighting. And by the time that understanding might have arrived, the campaign had already accelerated beyond the point where tactical adjustments could matter. Then came March 9, 1945, and everything changed scale. The raid that night was not a standard operation. It was a complete reimagining of how strategic bombing could be conducted, compressed into a single night over a single city. LeMay had stripped out the defensive guns. He had dropped altitude from 30,000 feet to 7,000. He had loaded incendiaries instead of high explosives. And he had sent 334 B-29's toward the most densely populated urban district in Asia. Japanese radar picked up the formation at approximately 11:15 p.m. Scramble orders went out to every fighter unit within range of Tokyo. Roughly 300 aircraft got airborne. What followed over the next 4 hours was the most consequential air battle in the history of the Pacific War. And most of the pilots who flew it did not survive long enough to understand what they had learned. The Pathfinder aircraft arrived first. They were flying at 6,500 feet, absurdly low, the kind of altitude where a Japanese pilot in a Ki-84 could close to attack range in under 2 minutes. The first interceptors reached the formation before the incendiaries had fully ignited below. And for approximately 45 seconds, Japanese pilots who had been struggling to intercept B-29's at 25,000 feet suddenly found themselves in what looked like a favorable tactical situation. The bombers were low. They were slow relative to normal high-altitude operations. The geometry of a firing pass was manageable. Then the guns opened up. Not from one direction, from everywhere. The upper turrets, the lower turrets, the beam turrets. 300 yards out, tracers appeared from positions the pilots could not immediately identify. 250 yards, and the tracking was not lagging the way a human gunner's tracking lagged. 200 yards, and the fire was ahead of where the fighter was going, not behind where it had been. Lieutenant Haruo Yoshida, a Ki-84 pilot from the 47th Fighter Regiment who survived the night, and whose account was recovered post-war, described his attack run on a B-29 at approximately 11:52 p.m. He had lined up a standard high-side pass from 8 o'clock. He pushed the throttle forward. He began his run at 400 yards. At 280 yards, his left wing was struck by fire he had not seen coming from a turret he had not been tracking. He broke left instinctively. The fire followed him through 15 degrees of turn before he lost altitude pulling away. He never closed below 250 yards. He made 3 more passes that night. Each time the fire was there before he expected it. Each time it tracked through his evasive maneuvers with a mathematical consistency that felt in his later written account less like a gunner leading a target and more like a trap that had been set before he arrived. He landed at 2:40 a.m. with 17 rounds in his airframe and no confirmed hits on any B-29. Across the battle space that night, the pattern repeated. Japanese pilots pressing attacks to close range found the convergence fire of multiple coordinated turrets waiting at exactly the distances their doctrine had told them were safe. Pilots who held back at 700 yards found accurate return fire reaching them at ranges their entire training said were beyond effective engagement. There was no good distance. The system had been designed to remove the concept of a safe approach angle entirely, and it was doing exactly that. Of the roughly 300 Japanese fighters that engaged the formation that night, 41 were lost to defensive fire. Another 23 were damaged severely enough to be written off. 64 aircraft, more than 20% of the total defending force, in a single engagement. The B-29's lost 12, 4%. When the after-action reports reached Kozono's desk the following morning, he read them for 2 hours without speaking to his staff. The close attack doctrine he had issued in December had not solved the problem. It had made it worse. The system was most lethal at exactly the ranges he had told his pilots to use. He had, without knowing it, written a doctrine that walked his best remaining pilots directly into the optimal engagement envelope of a computer-directed weapons network he did not fully understand. He rescinded the close attack doctrine on March 11, 1945. 2 days after the Tokyo raid. The rescission was tactically correct and strategically irrelevant, because by the time it was issued, LeMay had already ordered the follow-on strikes: Nagoya on March 11th, Osaka on March 13th, Kobe on March 16th. The pace of operations was faster than Japanese fighter units could reconstitute and reposition. By the end of March, 4 major Japanese cities had lost a combined 32 square miles of urban and industrial area to incendiary attack, and Japanese Fighter Command had concluded, in terms that appeared in formal planning documents, that contesting B-29 raids over home island cities was no longer a viable use of remaining aircraft. The defending force would be held back, conserved, save for the expected American invasion of Kyushu, where it would be expended in mass kamikaze attacks against landing craft. For Robert Hatch, following the campaign from data reports in Guam, the numbers told a story that he found both satisfying and deeply uncomfortable. The Central Fire Control System was performing beyond its design specifications. In engagements where B-29 crews followed full CFC doctrine, the effective deterrent range against attacking fighters had extended to nearly 1,000 yards. Japanese attack profiles were becoming shorter, less committed, more likely to break off before achieving a firing solution. Loss rates for B-29s operating in full formation with active CFC were running at roughly half the rate of the campaign's early high-altitude phase. The machine was working. The war was being won in ways that could be measured in columns of numbers on procurement reports. But in April 1945, Hatch received a piece of information through Wyrick's office that he did not put into any report. A translation of a captured Japanese tactical document written by a fighter unit commander in Osaka that had been passed up through intelligence channels and flagged for its analytical clarity. The document described the B-29's defensive system in terms that were for the first time essentially accurate. The Japanese officer had deduced the computational element, the turret coordination, the engagement envelope. He had figured out from the evidence of his losses what he was actually fighting. The document was dated February 28, 1945, 9 days before the Tokyo raid. It had never reached the pilots who flew that night. And that gap between understanding and communication, between knowledge and application, was a story about something larger than one weapon system or one campaign. It was a story about what it costs when information arrives too late, and about what it means to be the man who built the thing that created that gap. In Part 4, we will ask the question the data cannot answer. What happened to Robert Hatch after the war ended? What becomes of the men who build the machines that kill people they never see in places they never go for reasons they believe in but do not fully understand? And what is the legacy of a weapon so effective that it helped end a war, and so precise that it changed forever what war was allowed to look like? The last chapter is the one nobody talks about, and it might be the most important one. Over 3 parts we have followed one of the most extraordinary technological stories of the Second World War. a 34-year-old engineer from Schenectady with a folder full of equations and a wooden gear model built on weekends. A system that every experienced officer said was too complicated, too theoretical, too untested to trust in combat. A 2-year battle against institutional resistance, followed by a formal demonstration that changed doctrine across an entire theater of war. And then the raids themselves night after night over Japan, where the Central Fire Control System performed exactly as designed, while Japanese fighter commanders wrote after-action reports they didn't have the framework to understand. But nobody ever asks what happened to Robert Hatch after the guns stopped firing. Nobody asks what it costs to be the man behind the machine. And that is the part of this story that matters most. The war in the Pacific ended on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio address that most of his subjects had never heard his voice before. In the weeks that followed, the administrative apparatus of victory began processing itself through paperwork. Commendations were written, medals were awarded, promotions were confirmed. The men who had commanded the raids, the generals who had made the decisions, received the public recognition that history attaches to rank and authority. Robert Hatch received a letter. It came from the Army Air Force's Procurement Office and thanked him in the careful language of official correspondence for his contributions to the B-29 fire control program. The letter was signed by a colonel he had never met. It was placed in a file. The file was placed in an archive. And Robert Hatch got on a train back to Schenectady and returned to his drafting table at General Electric, where the post-war contracts were already coming in for industrial turbine components. He did not receive a medal. He was never promoted because he had never held a military rank to begin with. His name appeared in no headline. When the strategic bombing surveys were published, the Central Fire Control System was mentioned in technical appendices that almost nobody read. The engineers who built it were not listed by name. They were referenced collectively as General Electric Ordnance Division personnel, which is the kind of credit that history gives to the people it has already decided not to remember. Colonel Wyrick, the man who had given Hatch his one chance at the formal evaluation on Saipan, retired from the Air Force in 1947 and became a procurement consultant in Washington. He and Hatch exchanged Christmas cards for 11 years. General Donahue, the man who had spent months resisting the system before reversing his position with the clinical efficiency of a good officer, updating a tactical assessment, received the Distinguished Service Medal in 1946 and retired as a Major General in 1952. His citation mentioned his contributions to B-29 bomber doctrine. It did not specify which contributions. Hatch worked at General Electric until 1971. He never spoke publicly about the Central Fire Control Program. There is a single recorded instance of him discussing it in a 1963 internal GE company newsletter that was asking senior engineers to reflect on their wartime work. Hatch's contribution was 4 sentences long. He described the system in technical terms, noted that it had performed well in combat, and expressed satisfaction that the engineering had been sound. He did not mention the pilots it had helped kill. He did not mention the cities. He went back to his turbines. He died in Schenectady in 1979. His obituary in the local paper described him as a retired industrial engineer and a veteran of the Second World War, which was technically accurate and told you almost nothing true about him. But here is what his obituary did not say. What his 4 sentences in the company newsletter did not say. What the technical appendices in the strategic bombing survey only implied in the language of statistics. The Central Fire Control System that Robert Hatch built in his spare time on a wooden board 11 pounds wide became the direct technological ancestor of every remotely operated weapon system in use today. Every drone weapon station, every remote turret on a modern armored vehicle, every computer-assisted targeting system in the inventory of every military force on Earth that can afford one. They all trace their conceptual lineage back to the same fundamental insight that Hatch put on paper in 1942. Separate the aiming from the shooting. Put the computation between them. trust the machine to solve the physics that human reflexes cannot solve fast enough. When American engineers began developing the first remotely operated gun stations for B-52 bombers in the early 1950s, they worked from B-29 system documentation. When the concept was adapted for ground vehicles in the 1990s, the engineers working on those programs were building on 6 decades of accumulated refinement that started in Erie, Pennsylvania. The Predator drone's weapons integration philosophy, the principle that an operator sitting in a climate-controlled facility in Nevada can direct lethal fire with precision against a target 10,000 miles away, is Robert Hatch's gear and cam analog computer scaled up by 70 years of digital engineering and applied to a different kind of aircraft in a different kind of war. The B-29 Central Fire Control System was officially credited with 27 confirmed aerial kills during the Pacific Campaign. That number understates its actual effect enormously. The deterrent impact, the attacks that were broken off early, the approaches that were never pressed to firing range. The pilots who survived because they judged correctly that closing to engagement range against a CFC-equipped formation was not survivable cannot be counted in confirmed kills. What can be measured is this: B-29 loss rates in formations employing full CFC doctrine ran at approximately half the rate of the campaign's early phase. Over the course of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, roughly 400 B-29s were lost to all causes. The system's deterrent effect, conservatively estimated, is credited by post-war analysis with preventing somewhere between 150 and 200 additional losses. Each B-29 carried 11 men. The math is straightforward and carries significant weight. The post-war analysis also revealed something about the Japanese side of the equation that reframes the entire story. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces lost approximately 1,900 aircraft to B-29, defensive fire and related causes during the strategic bombing campaign. Of those losses, a disproportionate number occurred in the period after December 1944, when Kozono's close attack doctrine sent pilots directly into the system's optimal engagement envelope. The doctrine change that was meant to solve the problem of B-29 accuracy made things worse by a factor that post-war Japanese military historians described with admirable precision as decisive. The lesson that this encodes is one that military institutions have been learning and forgetting and relearning for as long as there have been military institutions. Understanding a threat partially is sometimes more dangerous than not understanding it at all. Kozono knew the B-29 had improved accuracy. He did not know the computational basis of that accuracy or what it meant for engagement range geometry, so he drew a tactically coherent conclusion from incomplete information and sent his men into the worst possible approach profile for the worst possible reasons. The gap between what he knew and what he needed to know cost Japan 60 aircraft and their crews in a single night over Tokyo. Information that arrives too late, or arrives incomplete, or arrives at the wrong level of the command structure is not the same as information. It is a different thing entirely. It is a map with missing terrain. That principle did not end in 1945. It has not ended yet. Every military organization that has ever failed to anticipate a technological shift has failed in exactly this way, not through stupidity or cowardice, but through the specific and predictable failure of existing frameworks to accommodate genuinely new information. The B-17 pilot, who learned everything about manual bomber defense and could not update his mental model fast enough when the B-29 arrived. The Japanese fighter commander, who understood traditional bomber vulnerability and could not process a system that eliminated traditional vulnerability entirely. These are not exceptional failures. They are the normal response of competent, experienced professionals encountering something outside the boundary of their accumulated expertise. The insane ideas that change wars are always insane by the standards of the frameworks they replace. That is not a coincidence. It is the definition of the thing. Now here is the detail that almost nobody knows. the detail that was sitting in declassified archives for decades before researchers pieced it together fully. The wooden gear model that Robert Hatch built in his own time, in 1942, the 11-pound demonstration board with the hand-machined cams that first proved the concept to a visiting procurement officer, was not destroyed. It was not lost. It was not thrown away when the actual production system made it obsolete. Hatch kept it. He took it home to Schenectady in 1945. It sat on a shelf in his workshop for the rest of his life. When his estate was settled in 1979, his daughter found it among his tools and, not knowing what it was, donated it with a box of other mechanical items to a local historical society. It sat in storage unlabeled for 23 years. In 2002, a researcher working on the history of analog computing at General Electric identified it from photographs in Hatch's personal papers, which had been donated separately to the Schenectady County Historical Society by a different family member who also did not know what they contained. The gear model and the personal papers were reunited in 2003. They are held together now in the Historical Society's collection, accessible to researchers cataloged correctly and visited by approximately 40 people per year. 40 people per year to see the object that sits at the origin point of every remotely operated weapon system in the modern world. 40 people to stand in front of the 11-pound wooden board with the hand-machined gears and the hand-cranked demonstration mechanism and understand that this is where a specific and consequential future began in a man's spare time on evenings and weekends, because he had looked at an impossible physics problem and decided that the impossibility was an engineering challenge rather than a reason to stop. From a slightly overweight engineer with bad eyesight and a drafting table in Schenectady to a technology that shaped the air war over Japan, prevented hundreds of American aircraft losses, and seeded the conceptual foundation for weapons systems that are still being designed and deployed today. Robert Hatch proved that the most consequential innovations in history rarely announce themselves with the authority they deserve. They arrive as memos, as folders dropped on desks, as gear models built on wooden boards in rooms where nobody important is watching. The Japanese pilots who flew against the B-29 were not defeated by superior courage or superior training. They were defeated by the accumulated weight of an industrial and intellectual investment made years before the war began, compressed into a machine that could think faster than they could react. That gap between what you understand and what is actually happening to you is the most dangerous space in warfare. And in the spring of 1945, over the burning cities of Japan, that gap was 11 pounds of hand-machined gears, built by a man whose name you had never heard before today. If this story stayed with you, there are hundreds more like it, waiting: the quiet engineers, the overlooked solutions, the ordinary people who built extraordinary things in extraordinary times. Subscribe, leave a comment with the innovations you want us to cover next, and do not miss what is coming. Because the next story is even more remarkable than this one, and the man at the center of it was even more anonymous than Robert Hatch, which means the gap between what he did and what history remembers is even wider. And closing that gap is exactly what we are here for.